I have recently read two extremely fine novels, and I must write about them here, since the vivid after effect of reading them felt incomparable to that of anything else. They were called Madame Edwarda and My Mother, from a book entitled Divinus Deus by Georges Bataille. In the past, Japanese readers of Bataille have been afflicted by bad translations. This time, however, the translation by Kosaku Ikuta has clearly come out better. The writers I pay most attention to in modern Western literature are Georges Bataille, Pierre Klossowski, and Witold Gombrowicz. This is because in their work there can be found a vivid, harsh, shocking, and immediate connection between metaphysics and the human flesh that forms a direct link between the 18th and 20th centuries, bypassing the 19th. These works reveal an anti-psychological delineation, anti-realism, erotic intellectualism, straightforward symbolism, and a perception of the universe hidden behind all of these, as well as many other common characteristics. Bataille's Madame Edwarda is a novel that demonstrates the manifestation of God to man, and is at the same time a work that is extreme in its obscenity. The narrator pays for Madame Edwarda, a prostitute who calls herself God, at the whorehouse, the Mirrors. He then follows Edwarda when she wanders out, wearing a black domino covering her face and naked body, witnesses her sudden fit, and helps her into a taxi where he sees a manifestation of the true God in Edwarda, who sits on top of and copulates with the taxi driver. When read together with My Mother, it will be noticed that the image of the mother overlaps with that of Edwarda, and with it a vision of defilement, of incest which violates the sanctity of the Sacred Mother. But in these works, the Sacred Mother does not suffer passively as a victim of trespass. She herself spurs others on and forces them into an experience filled with terror, repulsion, and ecstasy, which leads them to witness God. However, my aim here is not to develop a theory on Bataille. I have too many things that I would like to say about Bataille in this limited space. What is certain, nevertheless, is that being aware that the sacred quality hidden in the experience of eroticism is something impossible for language to reach. This is also due to the impossibility of re-experiencing anything through language. Bataille still expresses it in words. It is the verbalization of a silence called God, and it is also certain that a novelist's greatest ambition could not lie anywhere else but here. A woman was chosen to represent the God, who appears in the novel through the essential unity of the spirit and the flesh, embodied in woman, and the recognition that the mother, thought to represent the highest virtue in woman, and the whore, thought to represent the dirtiest, both originate from the very same part of that flesh. You may recall the words of Baudelaire, who called God a representative of whores. It is an impossible task to appreciate Bataille in a business-like manner with these intellectual interpretations, but in order to read this novel, especially its translated text, it is necessary to suppose that only the part that managed to break through the limits of language is left. In the preface, Bataille says, "If there is nothing that surpasses our powers and our understanding, if we do not acknowledge something greater than ourselves, greater than we are despite ourselves, something which at all costs must not be, then we do not reach the insensate moment towards which we strive, and which at the same time we exert all our power to stave off." This insensate moment is, needless to say, the moment in which God, grotesque and fearful, appears. The existence in us during these interludes exists through nothing but a sustaining and ruinous excess, when the fullness of horror and that of joy coincide. What, leaving aside the representation of excess, does truth signify if we do not see that which exceeds sight's possibilities, that which it is unbearable to see, as, in ecstasy, it is unbearable to know pleasure? A very typical Christian way of thought is apparent in Bataille's idea that, in short, God does not manifest himself while our being remains in its proper balanced form, and only when our existence exceeds this life and leaves behind it something like the outlines of the people left on the stone steps of Hiroshima after the atomic bomb was dropped. Then will God manifest himself. What is unique is his utilization of eroticism and pain in the extreme as a means of attaining it. Madame Edwarda begins with a simple paragraph introducing the narrator, a very typical lascivious drunkard. Having witnessed two furtive whores sneaking down the stair of a urinal, the narrator, haunted by lust and anguish, starts on a drinking spree from one bar to another as the day goes on. This introduction is over in 6 lines. The story takes a sudden turn in the following paragraph. The drunkard, who could not control the urge to be laid as bare as was the night, takes his trousers off in the street to hold my straight-risen sex. What is about to happen? Suddenly the rules of the world fall down with the trousers. With frightful speed, the story takes the narrator to the whorehouse, the mirrors, and introduces him to the whore, Madame Edwarda. Truly French simplicity abounds in the description, dizzy as if rushing up a spiral staircase, of taking her from the crowd consumed by blind drunkenness and sexual provocation to her room, and of their copulating. The woman, having raised one leg, pulls at the skin of her thighs with both hands and shows off her hairy and pink crack, just as full of life as some loathsome squid, then declares herself to be God. All these descriptions, through their simplicity, speed, and density, are elegant. Elegance, as far as literature is concerned, is nothing but a question of having a straight posture. I recall with interest Fumiyo Enji's criticism of Akiyuki Nosaka's Eroji Shitachi, where she described it simply with the word elegant. And in following the whore's ritual of the lady going up, Madame Edwarda has risen from amidst disorder and foulness with a dignity and splendor which is almost tragic, and which reminds us of Jean Genet's technique of glorifying filth. It is undoubtedly a royal consecration. Now, this short novel is intended as a horrifyingly simple testimony to God's existence, and into its structure is woven a feeling of suspense, as in a thriller. When does God manifest himself to man, and when is God's existence borne out? It is constructed with great care, as if it were a one-act play. In the first scene, where the narrator meets Madame Edwarda, sleeps with her, and pursues Edwarda, who puts on a domino cloak over her naked body and suddenly leaves, the narrator does not yet reach the experience of witnessing God, although Edwarda herself bears the name of God, and the proof of God's existence is still omitted. Then, when the narrator sees Edwarda in black, standing under an arch, as distressing as an emptiness, a hole, he, who, through sexual discharge, has been freed from her and is thus freed from intoxication, recognizes that Edwarda, as she herself has declared, is God. It can be argued, however, that this is in fact a theoretical God, a Cartesian God that was reached through the intellect awoken from sensual lust, through an illumination. This is, in a sense, this ingenious novelist's trick. Moreover, in this central scene, the writer lets a woman in black clothes and a mask run around the deserted big city late at night and creates a mysterious atmosphere, so completely different from the previous scene, as if to invite the reader into a gigantic temple. Here Edwarda suddenly convulses and exposes her white naked body, writhing in a spasm, in front of the narrator and the reader, like a white crack in the darkness. It is the narrator who is watching. It is the narrator who is spending, with a kind of cold anxiety, the time that shifts little by little inside the nothingness of seeing, like the sand in an hourglass, the essence of one's own existence towards an object. She calls herself God, and the narrator too recognizes God. It is about this time that God could be seen. When will he appear? Before this despair and anguish, and the spasm in Edwarda's naked white body, which is the physical manifestation of them both, the narrator almost touches the crack between sufficiency of being and excess of being, but never quite. But something leapt in my heavy despair. The fever's desiccating ecstasy was issuing out of my utter inability to check myself. ecstasy is again needed. Hence the narrator falls from a hitherto almost mathematical depiction into one of derangement. Words are cast off, and he becomes trapped in a struggle. I shall have written in vain. This comment on the impossible, its inaccessibility through language, is not a mere full stop in the novel, but constitutes a subplot towards the erotic experience of witnessing God in the last scene. The novel reaches its true climax in a taxi in the final scene. The scene of copulation with the taxi driver consists of 10 or so lines, in which a glimpse can be caught of the darkest abyss of human existence, at the same time as that of the pure and clear twilight domain which arises from there. Here Bataille shows a force of impact as a novelist, which momentarily dazzles. The word God is no longer used explicitly. The narrator attains abandonment, relinquishes even seeing, and confesses, "My own distress and fever seem small things to me." But then God, in fact, manifests himself at that very moment, and it becomes certain that the narrator did see God. Madame Edwarda is indeed a peculiar novel. Although it can seem an arbitrary, undisciplined work compared to, for instance, an exemplary classic short novel such as Prosper Mérimée, Matteo Falcone, there is a hidden, strict classical structure within it, if you read it carefully. You come to appreciate that the choking intensity ferments as a result of such a classical composition. Georges Bataille's My Mother is a medium-length work that takes the form, as a complete change from Madame Edwarda, of a French-style classic of the psychological novel. In fact, this remains a mere form, and from My Mother we learn that Bataille is a writer proficient in those classical techniques of ordinary novelists. Although he could easily make do with those techniques only, he, boldly, did not find interest in anything but the very subjects that undermine the deepest roots that those techniques are founded upon. This is how, as a result, he becomes for the reader an author who is extremely fastidious, but rewarding. The narrator was a 17-year-old youth when his father died. It was 1906. He hated his father, who, in his drunkenness, used to torment his wife, and once even considered entering the church as a revolt against his anti-clericalism. Finally, however, he gives up the idea of becoming a priest in order to live with his mother. She is to him sacred, and he worships her. Up until then, in the boy's eyes, his mother has been a sorrowful, innocent victim of the tyrannical father. He, dissipated by drinking, women, and gambling. She, a sweet, beautiful being who calls her boy my gallant lover. Up to that point, the boy solely desired to be her perfect knight. So far, it is a commonplace story, and the simple beginning consists of several fine paragraphs that, while stripped of rhetoric, are still quite exquisite. Of the secret drinking habit of the sad, beautiful mother, the boy was aware even when the father was still alive. But with the father's death, the image of the mother is radically transformed. She makes the unexpected confession that she is even worse than the father. Her hideous, distraught smile was the smile of woe. The boy's whole life, to his surprise, had depended upon plots contrived by parental solicitude. Later she was to borrow a phrase from my father, "Just lay the blame for everything on me." That was his wish, understanding that in my eyes my mother was beyond reproach, and must at all costs remain that way. The truth is gradually revealed. At the end, his mother commits suicide. Here are her words that could have been her will. "What I want is that you love me even unto my death. For my part, it is in death that I love you at this very instant. But I don't want your love unless you know I am repulsive and love me even as you know it." This story, which, as a climax to this perversion and madness, concludes in a scene of sacred incest in which spirituality is unveiled, is one that I can only leave to the reader to appreciate. But for me, it would be certain that this work managed to satisfy a thirst that no recent Japanese novel could assuage. As the truth about the boy's mother is exposed, Bataille's writing leaves the gentle, moderate style that has been maintained so far, and as if to prove that the walls of this comfortable home, which had seemed so stable, were in fact merely made of cardboard, he thrusts out one sharp blade after another and carries on ripping away in an excess of brutality. I want to read contempt in your eyes, contempt and fear. This was the last wish expressed by the mother, both as a mother and as a woman. To corrupt someone is to awaken them to truth, and she must be the personification of that truth, the truth she adheres to, not its mouthpiece. In short, she has ultimately to be God herself. This is probably the fundamental structure of Bataille's novels, and I sometimes detect the remains of an 18th century deism in Bataille, remains of which lead the mother to say, "It is only in debauchery that I feel most lucid." What is this sincere love that drives her to let others, moreover her beloved son, experience a vision of God? She, a disciple of Sappho? For us, reading a novel is a half-sensual, half-intellectual investigative experience. The hope and anxiety, what is going to happen, and the hope for a solution to questions of why, what for, who. These are the naive, fundamental desires of anyone who gives themselves up to reading novels, whatever their quality. The Bildungsroman often uses the first person, as that voice is the easiest to communicate sensations to the reader. It is the genre in which the reader identifies with the hero, and which, by arousing the reader's intellectual curiosity and his will to know, makes them retrace in a short period the whole process through which the hero develops, which in reality is stretched over many long years. Bataille's novels set their face against such a conception. They might be called an education in corruption, but the fundamental structures of the two are very similar. Namely, this is a novel so designed that the narrator represents the reader's own naive, investigative desire, his desire to intellectually analyze, his self-consciousness, his lyricism, his sexual desire, etc. Thus the reader, as an inevitable result of those desires, is forced to face the truth which he would otherwise never want to see but could no longer avoid, and only by going through this loathing and horror witnesses the truth that is God. Then what is the mother? The mother is a seducer who tempts us towards God. She is even God herself. She is well aware that she is the only path through which one is seduced to the highest truth, the path of sensuality, and this path must lead into derangement. Her love is cruel. She does not lose herself, but leads the other party astray, leads them to the border of destruction. Whipping them mercilessly, she severely demands of them the last arousal of their desires, be they of the flesh or of the spirit. "You still do not know what I want," the words the mother speaks to her son. At his last gasp, entangled in the truth he has just found out about the corruption of his mother, are evidently words of God. Looked at from one point of view, however, God is an idler, an immovable whore laying on a bed. It is always the human who is forced to labor, forced to make efforts, to be knocked down. No novel attempting to depict God's side can be more than a fragment of subtle despair, into which is mixed love and intellectual frustration in the face of the absurdity of man, the sun. God is like a hippopotamus, motionless in tropical mud. Your mother is only at peace in the mire. Bataille dispassionately points out that men's denial of God, the desperate cry of denying the existence of God, does, in fact, not come from their true heart. That true heart embodies the very core of what we call Bataille's eroticism. After all, was it not thanks to him that this abyss of eroticism was opened up to us? An abyss which a certain vulgar Viennese psychoanalyst was evidently incapable of exploring. Nevertheless, as I said earlier, Bataille never neglects to weave into this erotic metaphysical novel well-planned psychological procedures that are central to the novel. Indeed, it can only be a psychological novelist who can make the mother feel no peace in her soul until, having made her innocent son tidy up his dead father's desk so that he would find a collection of pornographic photographs, and, having foreseen his disgust, she could share that repulsion with her son in order that this shared emotion race her into a state of madness. It is an immediate consequence that tenderness overflows like honey. Like a wave, love rises up with shared suffering in sweet beauty, from which a cruelty will arise. And in order to carefully prepare the novel's denouement, the incestuous act consummated between mother and son, the writer deliberately reveals the outcome, the mother's suicide, and hints that her suicide springs as much from her remorse for the situation, where, eventually, she did not have any choice but to invite her son into her bed, as from despair. I did not desire my mother. She did not desire me. This, incidentally, is no more than a psychological analysis, a procedure to convince the reader. That is enough as a psychological delineation for a novel. However, since it was not the writer's intention to represent a mere personal psychological tragedy, he deliberately forewarns the reader so that once he is assured of the ending, Bataille is prepared to push the reader into the spiritual and intellectual incest between mother and son, which is ultimately more horrifying, more sensual, and more corrupt than physical incest. The mother herself says, "The mind's pleasure, fouler than the body's, is purer, and the only one whose edge never dulls. Vice, in my view, is like the mind's dark radiance which blinds, and of which I am dying. Corruption is the spiritual cancer reigning in the depths of things." What was man to her? A disciple of Sappho? A man never occupied her thoughts, never penetrated except to satiate her desert where she burned, where her wish seemed to be that, along with her, the silent beauty of anonymous and undifferentiated persons undergo foul destruction. In this kingdom of lust there was no room for tenderness. The gentle and loving were banned from this place, described in the words of the evangelist, "Violenti rapiunt illuid." My mother destined me to that violence over which she reigned. This final confession in the novel My Mother is a horrifyingly tense soliloquy. I will not, however, quote it here, as its true depth only speaks to the emotion of someone who has read the whole book.